The rain had not stopped for 3 days when the stranger walked into the White Hart Inn on the Bath Road, and Nell Thornton, who had been wiping the same glass for the better part of a quarter hour because the evening was slow and the fire was low and there was nothing else to do with her hands, set the glass down and watched him cross the threshold as though the weather outside were a personal inconvenience he had chosen to tolerate rather than a storm. His coat was dark and soaked through at the shoulders. His boots were good, too good for a man traveling alone without a valet, and he carried no trunk, only a leather case held close against his ribs as though it contained something he would not trust to a coach roof. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. Not the way the drovers looked, assessing what the bar might offer them beyond ale. Not the way the coach passengers looked, already calculating whether the sheets would be damp. He looked at her the way a man looks at a painting hung in the wrong room, with a flicker of confusion, followed by a stillness she could not read. Then he crossed to the bar, set the case down, and said in a voice so level it might have been discussing the price of oats, "A room, if you have one. The name is Hale." She had a room. She always had a room. The White Hart was not the sort of inn that turned travelers away, because it was not the sort of inn that filled. It sat at the unfashionable end of the Bath Road, 12 miles past the last coaching stop anyone remembered, and its custom was farmers, wool merchants, the occasional lost curate, and once a woman who had wept into her soup for 2 hours and left before dawn without paying. Nell wrote the name in the register. Hale, no title, no county, no forwarding address. His handwriting, when he signed below hers, was precise and slightly forward-leaning. The hand of a man who had been taught penmanship by someone who believed penmanship mattered. "Supper is at 8, she said. "The fire in the dining room is lit. I will take it here," he said, and sat at the table nearest the bar, and did not explain why. If you have ever walked into a room and known, before a single word was spoken, that the air in it had changed, you will understand what Nell did not yet permit herself to understand. She brought him bread and cold meat and a dish of stewed pears that Mrs. Phelps had made that morning, and she set them down without looking at his hands again, because she had already looked once, and once was enough. His hands were not a tradesman's hands. They were not a farmer's hands. They were the hands of a man who had never carried anything heavier than a book or a pen, or possibly a sword, and the signet ring on his smallest finger had been turned inward so the crest faced his palm. She noticed that. She said nothing. He ate slowly. He watched the fire. He watched her move behind the bar, and when she reached for the small leather-bound book of verse she kept beneath the counter, the one she read during the long hours when the inn was empty and the rain was the only company. His gaze followed the motion of her hand and stayed on the book's spine as though he recognized it. "Cowper," he said. She looked up. "The binding. I know it." "You read Cowper?" "I did once." He paused. "A long time ago?" It was not a conversation. It was a series of small doors opened and immediately closed, each one revealing a narrow glimpse of a room she was not invited to enter. He finished his supper. He rose. He said, "Good night, miss," and she noticed that he said, "Miss" rather than "girl" or "madam," or nothing at all, and that the word landed in the space between them with a formality that did not belong in a country inn on the Bath Road in October. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the storm. Nell Thornton had not always worked a bar. 6 months earlier, she had been Miss Thornton of Hartwell, the only daughter of the late Reverend James Thornton, who had kept a modest living in Somerset, and had educated his daughter as though she were a son, because he had no son, and because he believed that a woman who could read Greek was no less useful to the world than a man who could not. He had died in April. The debts had surfaced in May. £2,000 owed to creditors whose names she had never heard spoken in her father's study, whose letters she found in his desk drawer stacked in order of increasing fury, and whose patience had expired the moment the funeral was over. The living passed to a cousin. The house passed to the church. The books passed to an auctioneer in Taunton who sold the entire lot for £11 and did not think to tell her until afterward. Everything she had been, every room she had known, every shelf she had touched, was gone inside of 8 weeks. Mr. Phelps had known her father and offered her the position out of pity, and she had taken it because pity was the only currency she had left. She did not speak of this. She rose before dawn, lit the fires, laid the tables, served the meals, wiped the bar, poured the ale, counted the coins, and read Cowper when the light was good, and she did all of it in a dress that had been her mother's and shoes that were wearing through at the heel. And she did not complain, because complaint required an audience, and she did not have one. The stranger called Mr. Hale stayed a second night. He took his supper again at the table nearest the bar. He spoke little. He ate what she brought. He watched the fire. And he watched her. And the watching had in it a quality she could not name. A kind of focused quiet that was not curiosity, and was not hunger, and was not pity. It was closer to recognition, as though he had seen something behind the bar that the bar was not built to contain, and he was deciding what to do about it. She brought him a second glass of wine without being asked, because his first was empty, and because it gave her a reason to stand near the table for 3 additional seconds, and she was ashamed of those 3 seconds, even as she counted them. He took the glass. Their fingers did not touch. The distance between his hand and hers was perhaps the width of a thumb, and she felt it the way one feels the warmth of a candle from across a table. Not contact, only the knowledge that contact was possible and had been declined. "You read Greek," he said. She nearly dropped the cloth she was holding. She had not mentioned Greek. She had not mentioned anything about herself that was not required by the transaction of food and room and fire. "The annotations," he said, nodding toward the Cowper on the counter. "In the margins. The hand is yours, and the notes are in Greek. My father taught me. Your father was a scholar. My father was a clergyman. He believed they were the same thing." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement exactly, something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same county. "He was not wrong," he said, and returned to his wine, and the conversation ended, as all their conversations ended, on a sentence that could have opened into a room and chose instead to close like a door. That second evening, near 9 o'clock, a coach arrived unscheduled. The horses were lathered, and the coachman was furious, and the passengers who stumbled into the dining room were a stout wool merchant, his exhausted wife, and their daughter, a girl of perhaps 4 or 5 who had been crying for so long that her face was swollen, and her breath came in small ragged hiccups that shook her entire body. The mother sat down and put her head in her hands. The father shouted for brandy. The child stood in the middle of the room like a small bewildered animal caught in a lantern's light. And nobody reached for her. Nell did. She came around the bar and knelt on the floor in front of the girl, and she did not say hush or stop or there now or any of the words adults say to children when they want the noise to cease. She reached beneath her apron and brought out the book of verse, the Cowper, and she opened it to a page near the middle and began to read in a voice so low and steady that the child stopped crying, not because she had been told to stop, but because there was suddenly something in the room more interesting than her own distress. The words were not a child's words. They were Cowper's words, about a garden in winter, about the particular silence of snow on a hedge, and the child did not understand them, and it did not matter. What mattered was the voice. What mattered was that someone had knelt. Nell did not see the man at the table nearest the bar set down his glass. She did not see him lean forward in his chair and watch her with an expression that, had she turned and caught it, would have told her everything the next 3 months would take to confirm. She did not see his hand move to his breast pocket and rest there, briefly, over something small and hard beneath the fabric. "The fire in the private room is still lit," he said, his voice carrying across the dining room without rising. "Take the child there. She will sleep better away from the noise." It was not a suggestion. It was a command, issued with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in rooms far grander than this one. Nell looked at him. He did not look away. She rose, took the child's hand, and led her through to the private room, where the fire was indeed still burning. And she sat with the girl until the small body went limp against her shoulder, and the hiccups stopped, and the breathing steadied into sleep. When she returned to the bar, the table nearest the fire was empty. He had gone up. On the counter, beside her glass, lay a coin. Not a shilling. A sovereign. She picked it up and turned it in the light, and its weight in her palm was the weight of something she could not yet afford to name. The third morning was clear. The rain had broken in the night, and the October sun came through the inn's front windows in long yellow slats that caught the dust in the air and made the room look, for one brief hour, almost beautiful. He came down early, dressed for the road, his leather case beneath his arm. He crossed to the bar where she was already working, her hands busy with the morning's tasks, and he stood on the other side of the counter and looked at her with that same focused quiet and said, "I should like to know your name." "Thornton," she said. "Nell Thornton." "Miss Thornton." "Yes." He was silent for a moment. She waited for him to offer his own name, his real name, because she had known since the first evening that Hale was not the whole of it. No man with hands like that and a signet ring turned inward traveled without a title unless he had chosen to leave the title behind. "Hale," he said. "As I gave it." "As you gave it," she repeated, and something in the repetition made his jaw tighten, a movement so slight that she would not have seen it if she had not been watching his face with the same attention he had been watching hers. He paid for the room. He paid for 3 nights, though he had been offered a weekly rate. He paid what was correct, and not a penny more, as though the sovereign on the counter the night before had been a separate transaction entirely, one conducted in a currency that had nothing to do with money. Then he left, and the coach took him, and the bath road was empty again. And Nell wiped the bar and shelved the cowper, and did not think about the quality of his hands, or the weight of the coin, or the way he had said, "Miss Thornton," with the stress on the miss, as though it were a title he was restoring to her, rather than a form of address. 3 weeks passed. The inn grew quieter as November set in. The wool merchant stopped traveling. The coaches ran less frequently. The mornings came later and colder, and Nell lit the fires in the dark and stood over them with her hands extended until the feeling returned to her fingers, and she thought, sometimes, of a pair of hands that had never known this particular cold, and she put the thought away each time in the same place she kept all the things she could not afford. Mr. Phelps spoke of closing the bar for the winter and keeping only the rooms, and Nell understood what that meant. It meant she would not be needed. It meant the road would close and her wages with it, and the £2,000 her father had owed would go on compounding in some solicitor's office, while she stood in a cold kitchen with nothing to offer the world except a knowledge of Greek and a worn copy of Cowper. She had written to 2 schools in Bath and 1 in Bristol, offering her services as a governess, and the replies had been polite and final. She was too young, they said. She had no references. She had no connections. She had, in the language of the replies, nothing to recommend her except her own account of herself, and her own account was not, in this market, sufficient currency. Then the solicitor came. His name was Mr. Dawes, and he arrived on a Tuesday in a hired chaise with a letter bearing a seal she did not recognize. He asked for Miss Thornton. He sat in the private room and explained, in measured legal sentences, that he had been instructed by his client to offer Miss Thornton a position at Ashworth Hall in Derbyshire, as companion to the housekeeper, Mrs. Burrell, who was elderly and required assistance with the household accounts and correspondence. The salary was generous. The terms were immediate. The letter bore no name she recognized, only the seal and Mr. Dawes did not volunteer the name of his client, and Nell did not ask, because she understood that asking would not produce an answer, and because the alternative to accepting was the cold kitchen and the compounding debt and the closing road. She packed her mother's dress and the cowper and a shawl that had been her grandmother's, and she left the White Hart Inn on a Wednesday morning in Mr. Dawes's hired chaise, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her except the ghost of a stranger's steady gaze. Ashworth Hall was not a house. It was a principality. It rose out of the Derbyshire hills like something the landscape had produced rather than something men had built, and its windows caught the November light and threw it back in sheets of cold gold. And its drive was a quarter-mile of gravel bordered by elms that had been old when the first Duke was young. Nell stepped out of the chaise and stood in the drive, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, genuinely afraid. Not of the house. Of what the house implied about the man who had sat at the table nearest the bar and given his name as Hale. Mrs. Burrell was waiting at the side entrance. She was small, white-haired, sharp-eyed, and 70 if she was a day, and she took Nell's hand in both of hers and said, "You are the one from the inn." And the way she said it carried no judgment, only a quiet recognition that Nell had been described to her in terms that went beyond her usefulness with household accounts. "His Grace arranged it," Mrs. Burrell said, leading her through the servants' corridor. "The Duke of Ashworth. You knew him as Mr. Hale." The floor beneath Nell's feet did not move. The walls did not shift. The world went on exactly as it had been. And yet everything in it was different. Because the man who had sat in a country inn and eaten stewed pears and watched her read Cowper to a stranger's child was not a man at all. He was the Duke of Ashworth, one of the first peers of the realm, master of 11,000 acres, and a seat in the Lords, and a name that appeared in the papers with a regularity that made it almost ordinary. And he had hidden it from her. And he had sat across the counter and asked her name as though her name were something he needed. She did not see him that first day. She did not see him the second. The house held his absence like a held breath. His study door was closed. His place at the breakfast table was set and cleared untouched. The servants moved through the corridors with the particular quiet efficiency of a household that has learned to work around a grief it cannot name, and Nell recognized the rhythm because she had lived inside her own version of it for 6 months. Mrs. Burrell explained gently, over tea in the housekeeper's sitting room on the second evening, that His Grace kept to himself since the death of his wife. The Duchess Eleanor had died 2 years ago in the birth of their daughter Charlotte. And His Grace had been in London when it happened, summoned to a vote he could not refuse, and he had arrived home 8 hours too late. The locket he wore beneath his shirt, which Nell had seen his hand touch at the inn, contained a miniature of Eleanor, painted the year they married. He had not removed it since. He slept in the room they had shared. He took his meals alone. He walked the grounds at dawn before the household rose, and the groundskeeper had told Mrs. Burrell that His Grace sometimes stood at the edge of the lake where Eleanor had liked to sit, and stood there for a long time, and then turned back without having done anything at all. "He does not speak of it," Mrs. Burrell said. "He does not speak of very much at all. The child is the only thing that draws him out. And even with Charlotte, he holds her as though he is afraid she will break." In the locket was the face of a woman Nell would never meet. And in the nursery, at the far end of the east wing, was a child of 2 who had her mother's dark eyes and her father's silence. And Nell understood now why his coldness at the inn had not felt like contempt. It had felt like a man holding himself very still, because any movement in any direction might bring him closer to the thing he could not bear to touch. If you are still listening, stay close. The moment that changes everything is not far off, and it will be worth the wait. The household learned of her presence before the household was told. Lady Whitford, the Duke's aunt, who had installed herself at Ashworth Hall after Eleanor's death, and who regarded the estate's management as her personal jurisdiction, discovered Nell's arrival on the 3rd day and summoned Lady Cecily Graves, the young woman she had selected as the next Duchess, to tea in the morning room. "A tavern girl," Lady Whitford said, setting down her cup with the particular precision of a woman who weaponized crockery. "He has brought a tavern girl into this house and given her a title she does not possess, companion to the housekeeper, as though Mrs. Burrell requires a companion, as though Mrs. Burrell has ever required anything beyond a fire and a sharp tongue." Lady Cecily said nothing. She was 20, beautiful in the way that expensive education and excellent teeth produce, and she had been told since her 16th year that she would be Duchess of Ashworth. She did not yet know how to doubt what she had been told. Nell, in the kitchen, inventorying the linen cupboard Mrs. Burrell had directed her to, did not hear the words. She heard them later, in a different form, when a young footman named Thomas, whom she had spoken to kindly at supper, mentioned without malice that Lady Whitford had referred to her as the tavern girl twice in the space of an afternoon. "The tavern girl from the Bath Road," Thomas repeated, not unkindly, as though the phrase had already hardened into the household's shorthand for a thing that did not require further explanation. The label did not surprise her. Labels never surprised her. She had been the Reverend's daughter, then the orphan, then the debtor's child, then the bar girl at the White Hart, and now the tavern girl at Ashworth Hall. And none of these names were hers. And she had stopped expecting the world to call her by the right one. She met Edmund on the 5th day in the library by accident. She had come to shelve a volume Mrs. Burrell had borrowed, and he was standing at the window with his back to the room and Charlotte on his hip, the child's face buried in his neck. And he was not speaking and not moving, only holding her with the careful rigidity of a man who was afraid that if he shifted his grip even slightly, something inside him would give way. Charlotte made a small sound. He closed his eyes. Nell set the book on the shelf and turned to leave, and the floorboard beneath her foot betrayed her. He turned. Their eyes met across the length of the library, and the distance between them was perhaps 20 feet. And it was also the distance between a duke and a tavern girl, and the distance between a man in grief and a woman in debt, and the distance between a false name given in a country inn and a real name spoken in a house that contained everything the false name had been designed to escape. "Miss Thornton," he said. His voice was the same. Level. Low. Measured. "Your Grace," she said, and the title felt foreign in her mouth, because she had known him first as Mr. Hale, and Mr. Hale had been a man who watched the fire and asked about Cowper. And Your Grace was a title that belonged to this house and these windows and this library that held more books than her father's auctioned collection 10 times over. "You are settled," he said. It was not a question. "I am. Mrs. Burrell is very kind." "She is." He paused. Charlotte stirred against his neck. "You read to the child, at the inn, the merchant's daughter." "I did. She stopped crying. She was tired. She would have stopped regardless." "No," he said, and the word was quiet and certain, and closed the conversation, like a door latching. "She would not have." He left the library. Charlotte's small hand curled against his collar, opened and closed once as they passed through the door, a gesture so small and so involuntary that it might have been nothing. Nell watched it. Her own hand, resting on the shelf where she had placed the book, was trembling, and she could not have said why. The weeks before Christmas compressed around Nell like a narrowing corridor. Lady Whitford's preparations for the season's gathering transformed the house into a stage, and Nell understood, with the quiet clarity of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms, that the stage had been set specifically for her removal. The guest list was a careful instrument. Families of rank and influence were invited. Lady Cecily was given the room adjacent to the morning room. A dressmaker arrived from London to outfit Lady Cecily for the Christmas Eve dinner, and no one mentioned that Nell owned one dress, her mother's, and that its hem had been repaired twice and its cuffs were beginning to fray at the seam. She saw Edmund rarely. When she saw him, he spoke to her in the same level-measured sentences he had used at the inn, and she could not tell whether his formality was indifference or its opposite, and she did not trust herself to guess, because guessing would require believing that a man of his rank and his grief could look at a woman of her station and see something the world had missed. She had survived 6 months of loss by refusing to want anything she could not earn. Wanting Edmund, wanting even the idea of Edmund, was a debt she could not afford. Once, in the corridor outside the nursery, she came upon him unexpectedly. Charlotte had been fretful that afternoon, and Nell had been reading to her at Mrs. Burrell's request. The Cowper again, the garden in winter. And when she emerged into the corridor with the book still open in her hand, he was standing there. He had been listening. She knew it the way she knew where the fire was in a dark room by the warmth. "You should eat," he said. "You should—" His voice was low and did not carry past the space between them. "Mrs. Burrell says you work through supper." "I am not hungry, Your Grace." That was not a question. She looked at him. His jaw was set in that particular way she had first seen at the inn, the tightening that happened when he was preventing himself from saying something that existed beyond the edge of his composure. She nodded. She went to the kitchen and ate. Not because she was hungry, but because he had told her to. And the telling, stripped of its formality, was the same thing it had always been. It was care, dressed in the only syntax he permitted himself. Lady Whitford observed this exchange from the far end of the corridor. She said nothing at the time. She did not need to. The machinery of her response was already in motion, and the Christmas Eve dinner was 3 days away, and the guest list had been finalized, and every name on it was a witness she had selected. The Christmas Eve dinner was held in the great dining room. 40 guests, silver, crystal, candelabra, a table that ran the length of the room like a river of light. Nell was not invited. She was present because Mrs. Burrell, whose knees no longer permitted her to stand for the full evening, had asked Nell to oversee the serving arrangements from the side passage, a position that placed her within sight of the table and within hearing of every word spoken at it. Lady Cecily was seated at the Duke's right hand. She wore ivory silk. Her hair was dressed with pearls. She looked, Nell thought, exactly like what a duchess was supposed to look like. And the thought arrived without bitterness, only with the heavy factual weight of a thing observed and accepted. It was Lady Cecily who spoke the words, not to Nell, not even about Nell precisely, but loud enough that the table heard. A young viscount had asked, with the casual cruelty of a man making conversation, who the young woman was he had seen in the corridor, the one in the plain dress. And Lady Cecily smiled and said, "The tavern girl. She came with the household accounts, I believe, from some inn on the Bath Road. Lady Whitford has been very patient about it." The table rippled. Small laughter, quickly suppressed. A few glances toward the side passage where Nell stood with a serving list in her hand, and her back very straight, and her face composed into an expression that cost her everything she had. Then a guest Nell did not know, an older woman with garnets at her throat, leaned toward the Viscount and said quite clearly, "One does wonder what service a tavern girl provides that a proper companion could not." The laughter this time was not suppressed. Nell set the serving list on the sideboard. She folded her hands. She looked at the room, the silver, the crystal, the candles reflected in 40 wine glasses, and she thought of her father's study, and the books sold for £11, and the rain on the Bath Road, and the child who had stopped crying because someone had knelt. She thought of the sovereign on the counter, and the way Edmund had said Miss Thornton with the stress on the miss. She thought of all the names the world had given her, and she decided, in that moment, with the steady clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose, that she would not leave this room in silence. "I have no title," she said, and her voice was low and steady, and it carried. "I have no fortune. I have no claim on anyone in this room or on the hospitality that has been extended to me. What I have is my father's education and my own labor, and neither of those has ever required an apology." The room went silent. Lady Whitford's hand, holding her wine glass, stopped midway to her lips. Lady Cecily's smile thinned. The older woman with the garnets looked away. Nell turned and walked toward the door. She had 3 steps left to take when she heard the chair. It was the sound of a chair pushed back from a table, and it was followed by the sound of boots on stone, and the boots were not hurrying, because the man wearing them had never hurried in his life. And when Nell reached the threshold and turned, Edmund was standing. The room had gone so quiet that she could hear the candles. He did not cross to her immediately. He stood at the head of the table and looked down its length, and his gaze traveled from Lady Whitford to Lady Cecily, to the woman with the garnets, to the Viscount who had asked the question. And his face was the face she had seen at the inn, composed and still and readable, only if you knew what to look for. And what she saw now, for the first time, was fury. "Miss Thornton," he said. His voice filled the room the way his command had filled the dining room of the White Hart Inn, without rising. She stopped. He walked toward her. The distance between the head of the table and the threshold was perhaps 30 feet, and every guest in the room watched him cross it, and not one of them spoke. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He turned to face the table, and when he spoke, his voice was level and specific, and it permitted no negotiation. "Miss Thornton is to be the next Duchess of Ashworth. Anyone who cannot find it in themselves to address her accordingly may leave this house tonight." The words landed in the silence, like stones dropped into still water. Lady Whitford's wineglass met the table with a sound that was almost musical. Lady Cecily's face did not crumple. It rearranged, slowly, into an expression that was not grief exactly, but the dawning recognition that a thing she had been promised was not, after all, hers to claim. The woman with the garnets looked at her plate. The Viscount looked at his hands. Mr. Dawes, The solicitor, who had been seated at the far end of the table in his capacity as the estate's legal counsel, rose and said quietly, "The announcement will be entered in the papers tomorrow, Your Grace. I will see to it." Edmund nodded. He did not look at Mr. Dawes. He looked at Nell. "Nell," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Thornton. Not the girl from the inn. Nell. 2 letters and a breath, spoken in a voice that had been level for 2 years because level was the only register that kept the grief at a distance, and the word cracked the level open. And what was underneath it was not cold, and was not composed, and was not anything the room had seen from the Duke of Ashworth since the day his wife died. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her hand, which had been gripping the edge of the doorframe, released it, and the releasing was enough. Lady Whitford stood. Her posture was still perfect. Her face was still arranged. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not the polished sentence she had prepared, not the hierarchy protecting correction, not the careful dismissal. What came out was, "Edmund, you cannot." And the sentence stopped there, because she looked at his face and understood that he could, and that he had, and that the machinery she had spent 2 years maintaining had just been dismantled in front of every family whose opinion she had cultivated. She left the dining room. She did not run. She walked with the measured dignity of a woman whose authority had been publicly revoked. And the door closed behind her. And the candles flickered once in the draught, and then the room was still. Christmas morning came in silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm, not empty but washed clean. Snow had fallen overnight, and the grounds of Ashworth Hall lay beneath it like a new page, and the light through the library windows was white and soft, and carried no shadows. Lady Whitford had departed before dawn. Her trunks had been loaded in the dark, and the carriage had taken her down the drive without ceremony, and the elms had watched her go the way elms watch everything, with patience, and without comment. Lady Cecily had left the evening before, quietly, after a brief word with Edmund in the corridor that Nell did not hear and did not ask about, because the expression on Lady Cecily's face when she emerged was not anger. It was the look of a woman setting down a thing she had carried for a long time and finding that her hands, without it, did not know where to go. Nell sat in the window seat with Charlotte in her lap. The child had come to her that morning unprompted, had walked across the nursery floor on small, determined legs and held up her arms, and Nell had lifted her and felt the weight of her, the warm, solid fact of her. And Charlotte had settled against Nell's shoulder with the ease of a child who had found the shape she had been looking for. Edmund stood in the doorway. He did not enter immediately. He watched them, the woman and the child and the snow beyond the glass. And his hand moved to the locket beneath his shirt and rested there. And then, slowly, he let it fall. The gesture was small. The distance it covered was not. On the table beside the window seat, open to the page about the garden in winter, lay the cowper. Nell had brought it from the inn in her single bag, and it had sat on her bedside table through the weeks at Ashworth Hall, and now it lay in the library of a house that contained 10,000 volumes, and it did not look small. It looked like what it was. It looked like the book a woman had been reading when a man walked in from the rain and recognized her before he knew her name. Edmund crossed the room. He sat beside her on the window seat. Charlotte reached for him, and he took her. And for a moment the 3 of them were still in the white morning light, and the house around them was quiet, and the snow went on falling. "The garden in winter," he said, looking at the open page. "Yes." "Read it to me." She did. Her voice was low and steady in the silent room, the same voice that had calmed a stranger's child in a country inn on the Bath Road in October, and the words were about snow on a hedge and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a garden when the growing has stopped and the ground is resting. And Edmund listened, and Charlotte slept against his chest. And the fire in the grate burned low and warm, and outside the windows of Ashworth Hall the snow continued to fall, covering the drive and the elms and the hills beyond, and the world was very quiet. And it was enough. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nell's story moved you, leave a word, any word, in the comments. It means more than you know.